till I can't no more.
I got the horses in the back. Horse stock is attacked.
In the coming week, Hungary's Viktor Orban exercises sweeping executive powers amid the pandemic. Global and local media outlets face multiple pressures in the coronavirus outbreak, and Israeli leaders move to form a national emergency government. It's April 2nd, 2020, in time for The World Next Week. I'm Bob McMahon.
And I'm Jim Lindsay. Bob, I want to let all our listeners know that you and I are practicing physical distancing and recording this podcast from our respective homes. And because of that, we apologize in advance for any audio issues or if any members of our family make unanticipated guest appearances.
That includes members of the animal family as well. Jim, why don't we start by talking about developments in Hungary, because it could be part of some bigger trend. Earlier this week, the Hungarian parliament voted to allow Prime Minister Viktor Orban to rule by decree. And this move greatly expands his powers, which had been growing steadily for years, as we've discussed before in this podcast. There was some international pushback, although a relatively tepid note from the European Commission. Is this move by Hungary something that we should expect in a crisis like this, or something more troubling taking place, Jim?
It looks to be something more troubling, Bob, to be quite honest. We haven't seen a move like this in any other advanced industrialized democracy. Certainly haven't seen it in Europe. And I think it's important to note that what distinguishes the moves taken in Hungary over the past week is, number one, it allows Prime Minister Viktor Orban to rule by decree, extending a current state of emergency. The second thing, this state of emergency, this rule by decree, comes with no end date. So what has happened is that Parliament in Hungary has been sidelined. It's not going to meet. There could be no meetings, no referendums, no elections. And this raises really troubling issues about the future of democracy in Hungary. And again, it takes place against a broader backdrop that we've talked about a number of times on the podcast of what's sometimes referred to as illiberal democracy in Hungary.
Which Orban says outright. Orban says, yes, I am an illiberal leader, and he's proud of it.
Quite so. And he portrays it as the wave of the future. But I think we're starting to clearly move away from what could be under any reasonable description called a democracy to something else. And as you note, there was some pushback in Europe to this decision. The various European heads of state have spoken about it. You mentioned there was a document released by 13 EU member states this week that called on everyone to jointly uphold our European principles and values on this path. But again, most notably, the statement did not single out Hungary by name. And this raises a bigger challenge in Europe. What do you do about Hungary? What are the tools you have to sort of push Hungarians to come back to the founding principles of the European Union? Remember, when countries in Eastern Europe were trying to join the EU, they had to jump through a number of hoops, one of them being adopting democratic governance. And now we see Hungary step by step moving away from that, and the European Union discovering it doesn't have really good tools to change the behavior of the Hungarians. Now, the defense that the Hungarians will make is that this was voted on by our parliament, and the prime minister's party holds a supermajority in the parliament, and so this is perfectly permissible. Parliaments can vote as they wish. Indeed, Matteo Salvini, the head of Lega, the right-wing party in Italy, hailed this as Hungary's free choice. But again, that takes also against the bigger backdrop of which Hungary, through a variety of techniques, has made it harder for opposition parties, basically allowing the Fidesz party to sort of entrench itself and dominate Hungarian politics. So this decision doesn't come out of the blue. This decision isn't about simply what's happening with the coronavirus or the pandemic in Hungary. It is sort of the march of a deliberate nationalist, illiberal kind of politics that Orban has championed.
As you indicated, Jim, so there's opportunism here. We saw some of these steps play out 5 years ago or so during the migrant crisis, when Hungary, not necessarily besieged, although certainly dealing with migrants coming across its border, moved in certain illiberal directions that it has not moved away from. Now it's in the middle of this pandemic where, again, Hungary is not dealing with some of the huge numbers we're seeing certainly in Western Europe in the outbreak of this, but has decided that, it's going to look no further or opposition or occasion for that and has just taken this move. As you say, Jim, it's not just Hungary. I think we're looking next to nearby Poland, where it looks like the Polish government, also with nationalist party in charge or in charge of certainly the lower house and the presidency, are going to go forward with presidential elections in May, despite the concern about being able to conduct such an election at this time period amid a crisis.
Certainly, and there are worrying trends across Eastern Europe about the march away from democratic values, rules, and institutions. They're not all moving at the same pace. And they're very clear here. I think Hungary is at a different position, let's say Poland is in. But there are lots of troubling signs. We have the resurgence of nationalism across Europe, which is greatly complicating things, the scapegoating of others. And I will note in the particular case of Hungary that part of the changes enacted by the Hungarian parliament before it took itself out of business last week was to give the government greater powers to, quote, defend Hungary, and defend it particularly against those who are critical of what the government is doing. And again, we have seen over the past several years the Hungarian government shutting down what we would call civil society, that is free institutions, most notably targeting George Soros and institutions that George Soros has supported. Again, George Soros being Hungarian by birth, but it's been a particular target of vitriol from the Hungarian government.
Again, like the migrant crisis, it's sort of reinforcing this move toward nationalism and sovereignty. And in a place like Europe, where there had been the march of history sort of away from those things, seemingly, that is very much not the case. And in the case of this virus, where you have the imposition of border controls now, it seems like more than ever, the nation state is reemerged.
It has, but these borders are likely to be ineffective. We talked about this in the podcast before. If you look at Hungary right now, it has an estimated 1,000 or so cases. That is almost certainly an undercount because Hungary is not doing widespread testing. Because you already have the virus in the country, you have community transition, and this is going to be a bigger problem. And it's sort of the trend in terms of how the Orban government has responded to challenges in the past has always been to blame the other. And I would imagine that is going to continue, even though now the real challenge is the Hungarian government capable of marshaling the kinds of responses internally to diminish the disease, slow its transition, flatten the curve, and the like. And it's not at all clear that this government has that kind of capability. As I mentioned a moment ago, Bob, one of the troubling things about the steps that Hungarian parliament took last week is that it has really given the government more power to go after individuals that it believes are spreading false information. And it gets to be decided by the government what falls into that category. Now, again, you and I discussed that Washington and Beijing last month expelled a bunch of journalists. So there seems to be a broader trend of media outlets, journalists facing some real strong headwinds trying to cover this pandemic both globally and locally. Can you tell us a bit more about the challenges, Bob?
Certainly, Jim. It is, as you say, it's sort of typical in the authoritarian states at times like this for states to crack down further on any outlets that retain any independence or ability to report information independently, to crack down. So we're seeing this in China, Egypt, Turkey, Iran, Venezuela, and so forth. But also Hungary. Part of the decree we just mentioned referred to the ability of the prime minister to penalize those who release, including press outlets that release so-called false information. And certainly, if we take one side of this whole crisis, which is what I think the World Health Organization has called an infodemic, there is false information flying around that could cost lives about everything from false cures or false vaccines to naming and shaming or blaming in wrong directions and so forth. There is a lot of bad information flying around. So countries are getting very concerned. Democracies and authoritarian states alike are getting very concerned. However, what we're seeing is this kind of what's been called a double whammy of the virus, terror, and economic calamity happening to media right now. So they're facing pressure from countries everywhere, from Hungary to China. And even you see playing out at the daily White House press briefings where where President Trump has, on a regular basis, overstated some claims, made some false claims, according to a whole wide range of fact checkers, and has pushed back and, in some cases, bullied journalists who've tried to raise that issue, told their questions nasty and so forth, and has used the term fake news regularly on his Twitter account to dismiss those who would criticize the government's approach. So it's been a problem across the world, Jim, and it's occurring at a time when, one, the premium on proper, transparent information has never been higher, but also these organizations, some of which rely on advertising and other pillars of the economy, are reeling. They're having to furlough people right along with the Macy's and other big corporations of the world. And so they are stretched to cover this epic story, this historic story, at the same time facing pressure from governments, again, from democracies to authoritarian states, that are pressuring them for the way they release information.
Well, you're certainly right, Bob. And let's face it, the pandemic is an incredibly hard story to cover because there's a lot about the virus we simply don't know. Even when you go to experts and you ask them questions, they are to some extent flying blind. They're going on the basis of what they know with related viruses, past epidemics, but on issues such as, should you wear a mask or not?
That's a great example.
How reliable are the tests you take? What treatments do or do not work? And the like. They don't have definitive answers. And so, they often talk about the press as the first draft of history. And again, in many cases, we have reporters going out, covering stories, trying to tell you what they think they're hearing. And those stories and those pieces of advice get rewritten. It's particularly difficult when you have a president of the United States who has changed his discussion of the virus over the last several months. And as you note at these press briefings that are now being held daily, journalists have pointed out that the president said something contradictory days earlier, and his response to it isn't to try to explain the contradiction, but to attack the journalists. And I think that does send a rather bad signal. I also know, just as we were sitting down to do this podcast, that I got a news flash that Google, which had imposed a ban on advertising related to the pandemic, the coronavirus, has now decided to lift that ban. And it's also going to allow political ads that discuss or talk about the coronavirus. And so it's going to be interesting to see how all that feeds into the whole discussion loop in this country.
No, it's a very interesting point. And the tech giants in particular are interesting to look at in the way they've been trying to self-police, and they have been trying with mixed results. And also the way to which they've been offering gestures of support for independent media. Both Google and Facebook, among others, have made very large grants available to media. And they acknowledge that both of their business models have benefited mightily from the work of media organizations that have gone out and done original reporting and have created content that people then pass around on their sites that they gain revenues from, so forth. So that latest announcement you just noted, Jim, is going to be very interesting in both contexts, because it's not only a virus playing out right now, but there's still a very important U.S. presidential campaign playing out in which the rhetoric was already high before the pandemic, and it could get incredibly nasty. And infodemic is even a tepid word to describe it at this point.
I think you're quite right, Bob. I think it is going to be even more fractious. I note that you mentioned that several of the tech giants tried to, in essence, put a halt to bad information. I know Twitter was taking down tweets that it thought were misleading or factually incorrect. And on the one hand, you can applaud that, but you can easily see how challenging that can be to conduct on a consistent basis, given the large number of tweets and the fact that if someone, particularly anyone well-known, gets their tweet taken down or blocked, they can complain or point to somebody else and say, why wasn't their tweet taken down? This must be politically motivated and the like. And we've always tended to assume that you want to have a robust public debate. That's what the First Amendment is about. In essence, the idea that good information is going to drive out bad information. But I think one of the things we've learned in the age of social media is oftentimes bad information can stick in a way that truthful information doesn't. That's why it's important to have good journalism. But again, good journalism can lie in the eye of the beholder. I think some of the assessments of journalism hold journalists to a standard that's almost impossible to reach. If your notion is that a journalist can never get a story wrong, then you've almost condemned yourself from the start, particularly in a fluid situation like this, where literally the information is changing. And again, I'll go back to the issue of masks. I was told masks didn't work, then I was told they would work, then I was told that masks could only be used if you were contagious. Now we think maybe everybody should use it, but if you have a beard like I do, it's not going to help. And there's just a lot of confusion out there.
And then what is a mask? Is a mask a surgical mask? Is it is it a kerchief? When is a mask a mask?
No, again, this is, always the problem with journalism, reporting the facts, is that people come to facts with a frame, and you can dispute what that frame is. And people will say, well, you're focusing on all the mistakes the Trump administration made, but you're not focusing on the successes of the Trump administration. So what's the right balance there? To what extent should stories talk about what the administration is doing vis-a-vis what was done 6 months ago, a year ago, 2 years ago, and the like? And so in trying to sort of take out from all of the facts out there, try to have a coherent story that informs people, obviously requires making choices, and people can dispute those choices. But I think it's dangerous when we start beginning with the assumption that the people writing those stories are motivated by ill faith. Because I think, in my experience, journalists for a variety of different media outlets, they want to get stuff right, and they try very hard. And you can accuse them of saying you didn't frame it correctly in the right, but I don't think they're operating from a perspective of trying to steer the debate.
And I should also note, we've been fortunate at CFR.org to work with our in-house experts in the think tank on global health issues, Tom Boyke, Yanjong Huang, Tom Frieden, and their excellent new site, Think Global Health. That's a great benefit. There are some of the larger media that have long-term health experts as their correspondents. They are worth following, obviously. But then as you get to other media, including some that have a big following, they don't have people who are health experts, and they're trying to make sense of information on the fly, and it can get really tricky. So I've said this before, but it makes us sometimes long for the days of the old gatekeeper approach to journalism, where you had some of the big media, having more control over the way information was released.
You're exactly right, Bob. And again, when you start talking to scientists, they have their own language and they're comfortable with certain things. So one of the big controversies recently has been about models. Now, anyone who's a social scientist or a hard or natural scientist, you inherently know what the limitations of models are, depending on the assumptions you make. They can give you a range of outcomes. But if you're a journalist trying to report on that, it's kind of hard to give a reader a sort of graduate level introduction of models and still have time left over to get to the basic point you're trying to make. And that's why a lot of this gets complicated. And so journalists try to take complicated information to simplify it so people who aren't experts can track it. But then, of course, experts can come around and say, well, you missed this, you missed that, and what have you. And then that feeds into this sort of drumbeat of criticism about, obviously if a mistake was made, it wasn't because of the innate limitations of trying to simplify complex issues. It's because people are motivated by a desire to pervade fake news and the like. And again, as somebody who does a lot of writing for a living, it can be really hard to get things quite right. Indeed, among academics, peer review and the like, people come back and say, you missed this, you missed that. This de-emphasizes that. Trying to do it on the fly for the 5 o'clock news, or heck, we're on a 24-hour cable news cycle to get it out there, for the next media. It's a real challenge.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling, and this pandemic has many unrevealed truths to it yet, so we'll keep on pursuing it. But Jim, I wanted to turn our discussion to sort of a fascinating government forming exercise playing out in Israel. The leader of the Blue-White Coalition, Benny Gantz, looks to have finally agreed to form a national emergency government with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, this is a move that Gantz had resisted certainly before the coronavirus pandemic broke. The story's still unfolding, Jim, but can you give us a sense of what's going on in Israel?
Happy to, Bob, but again, I'll do it with the caveat of what we just discussed. This is an incredibly complicated story that sort of is difficult to telescope down into a couple of minutes. And indeed, when I tell this story, I sort of feel like I'm describing a series of events more fitting for fictional TV shows like The House of Cards or Designated Survivor than actual real-world politics. Now, again, the background for all of this in Israel is that Israel has had 3 indecisive national elections since last April. And essentially, the 2 big parties, Likud, headed by Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, and the Blue-White Alliance, headed by by former Army Chief of Staff Benny Gantz, who both picked up roughly 33 seats in each of these elections. Problem is you need 61 seats to form a majority in the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. So neither of these groups, the Likud or Blue-White Alliance, has been able to stitch together that majority government. So the Israelis have had to go back and vote again. So after last month's election, again, the third in just 1 year, Netanyahu came out with the most seats of his own party. But when he went out and tried to put together a coalition government, he could only get to 58 seats. So in the middle of last month, Benny Gantz was given a shot at assembling a governing coalition. Now, got to keep in mind, hovering in the background for all of this is that Prime Minister Netanyahu has been indicted on bribery, fraud, and breach of trust charges. Now, there's a quirk in Israeli law which says that if you're a criminal defendant, you can't serve in the government, with one exception, and that's the position of prime minister. So for Benjamin Netanyahu, what was going on really was an either-or moment. Either he stayed on as prime minister, and he's the longest-serving one in Israeli history, or he's going to be out of government. Now, with the call to have Gantz try to form a government, it looked like Netanyahu's political time may have run out. And indeed, it was reported that Gantz had cobbled together the magic 61 seats you need to form a government. Problem Gantz faced is that these various parties were mostly united in their opposition to Netanyahu, not to any set of policy measures. And again, think of, how do you operate if you have a coalition in which it only agrees on one thing? So then last week, Gantz stuns the Israeli political world by pulling a 180-degree about-face. He had campaigned by saying he would never sit in a Netanyahu-led government, and then he announced he would do just that. The deal that apparently was worked out between Gantz and Netanyahu would have Netanyahu stay on as prime minister for 18 months, and then with Gantz as the deputy prime minister. Then after 18 months, they would switch roles, and then the law would be revised so that anyone under criminal indictment could continue to serve as deputy prime minister, meaning Netanyahu could stay in the government. Well, this, moment just sort of erupts in Israeli politics, and a lot of speculation about, why did Gantz change his mind? And a variety of arguments being tossed out there. One argument is sheer patriotism. Gantz looked around. The country is facing the coronavirus pandemic, and that this was a time that the country had to rally together. And so he wanted to stand with Netanyahu to provide the leadership needed for the country to prosper and survive. Another argument is really the reverse of that it was fear. He was afraid that if he didn't join a national government, that he'd get the blame for not putting politics aside in a time of national crisis. Some people say this is all about realpolitik. That in essence, Gantz looked at his coalition and said, it's unmanageable. I can't make it work. And if I try to, I'm going to lose. A variety of other explanations as well. I don't know what the motivations are. It could be a mix of any of them. It could be something else. Clearly what happened was this decision meant the end of the blue-white coalition. Obviously, a lot of Israelis, those who were voting for change, were really unhappy, whereas those who liked Netanyahu and wanted his government to continue, they're happy. I do think one thing, as one emailer put it to me in describing what was happening in Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu has solidified his reputation as a political Houdini. Now, just one sort of big question mark here is we don't know whether the deal can be pulled off. And that's what we're going to be looking forward to in next week. So in keeping with TV political thrillers, all I can say is tune in next week.
Wow, Jim, that was a mouthful. I think I understand at least how we got here now. So we should not be looking for any sort of formal announcement, most likely until next week, pandemic notwithstanding.
Honest answer, Bob, I don't know. Would not surprise me the moment we wrap up this podcast that I'll have a news alert in my email inbox saying the Netanyahu-Gantz government is on. Conversely, I wouldn't be surprised if I got an email saying the Netanyahu-Gantz government is off. I mean, these are sort of fluid things. And I can't say, being 5,000 miles away from Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, that I have a good handle on the minute-by-minute pulse of Israeli politics. But clearly, this is a big issue in a country that is facing a big challenge, like many other countries are around the world. How do you confront this pandemic? How do you control it? It has been a real problem in Israel. Indeed, some people would argue, one of the things that Netanyahu Netanyahu has benefited from is he's seen as being decisive by many Israelis during this time of national crisis, and that's part of what put pressure on Gantz to reverse course. But again, a lot of things are fluid. We will see what will happen. But clearly, Israel's politics, like the politics of many other countries, is quite turbulent right now.
All right, fair enough.
Bob, this is typically the time of the week where we do our figures of the week. So I'm going to ask you, who or what is your figure of the week?
Well, Jim, as listeners of this podcast know, we are enthralled to space exploration, or certainly I'm enthralled to it. And that's the direction I'm going this week. My figures are persons, two American astronauts, Doug Hurley and Bob Behnken. And they are expected, despite the virus outbreak, but all things being equal, they are expected in May to be the first U.S. astronauts to launch into space on an American rocket and spacecraft from American soil since 2011. And if that space test flight goes well, there will be an official space flight at the end of this year with 4 U.S. astronauts leaving U.S. soil to rendezvous with the International Space Station. And that is something that Americans have not been able to claim in the aftermath of the space shuttle program.
So, Bob, why is this happening now, particularly given the pandemic, which is sort of focusing everyone's attention?
Well, maybe in the tradition of the space program proceeding in the past through all sorts of other turbulence, think about what the 1960s were like and the U.S. proceeding with its Apollo mission. Maybe there's a little bit of that involved here. There's also been this move towards privatization of space development. So these are NASA astronauts, but the vehicle or the space rocket they're flying is going to be the SpaceX Demo 2 flight test. And so this is the SpaceX, a private firm that is involved in building these rockets. And the whole idea, the model here is that the U.S. wants the private sector more heavily involved in investment into the space program. And they see this as getting back in the game and having a bit more wherewithal. I think this inexorable move, they hope, towards more of U.S. activity in space. We have been relying heavily on Russia, which it must be noted as it's been a very productive partnership amidst all the difficulties in U.S.-Russian relations over the last 10 years especially. Russia's Soyuz rockets have been the means by which the space station, which has U.S. and Russian astronauts primarily, has been equipped and the means for flight there and back. So here we now have another option, and more options in terms of space is a good thing, especially if it's an international endeavor. So I think it's all about trying to keep this going. I think, frankly, the world could use a bit of good news since it's not just a U.S. story, but it's a world story. There's going to be international astronauts joining on these flights in the years to come. And so I think it's just they feel like they can make this happen. Now, as we've been saying throughout this podcast, many things can change given the course of this pandemic, but it was significant. This was announced this week that this is going forward.
Well, I certainly hope they take all the precautions about quarantining these astronauts before they put them on a spaceship, given how infectious this disease is.
Yeah, absolutely. It's got to be a new level of heightened alarm, control, mitigation, you name it, to make sure that this is not brought into the environment of the space station. But Jim, who or what is your figure of the week?
Bob, my figure of the week is a number, and the number is 22. That is a number of partner nations joining with the United States in an operation being led by the U.S. Navy that is going to beef up counter-narcotics operations off the coast of Venezuela. This is set to be one of the largest military operations by the United States in the region since the 1989 invasion of Panama. President Trump announced this operation during his Rose Garden daily briefing on the coronavirus yesterday. It comes on the heels of last week's U.S. Justice Department indictment of Nicolas Maduro, president of Venezuela, and 14 other high-ranking Venezuelan officials on narcotics trading, drug trafficking, and narco-terrorism charges. And that indictment came with a $15 million reward for the arrest or capture of Mr. Maduro. And it is coming on the heels of a proposal the White House floated for Maduro and Juan Guaido. He is the alternative president backed by the United States, for both men to step down and for Venezuela to hold free elections. The Maduro government dismissed that out of hand, but it's going to be interesting to see where this is going in terms of this counter-narcotics operation. I will note that news reports have it that the Pentagon opposed the mission, arguing that right now is not the time to do it, given how challenging it is for the military to handle the spread of coronavirus among its own forces. Been a lot of talk over the last week of the USS Theodore Roosevelt, the aircraft carrier in the Pacific, which is not part of this operation, and its challenge with the coronavirus on board and sickening a fairly large percentage of the crew. So again, I think it can be interesting to watch what is actually happening down in Venezuela as the administration clearly is trying to find a way to up the pressure on the Venezuelan government. I will note it's been doing that for a while, and it hasn't produced any changes in Caracas.
Yeah, I think the timing issue is particularly interesting, as the news is only getting more stark involving the virus in the U.S. and around the world, to turn around several major initiatives related to Venezuela in this fashion seems a bit quizzical, but at the same time, as you said, the administration has been attempting in many different ways to try to gain some leverage and force a change in the situation in the leadership in Venezuela. Maybe it sees this finally as a chance to find some daylight.
It may be, and I think there's also a broader issue that people in the Defense Department are clearly worried about, and that is this moment where everyone is focused on the pandemic and institutions are dealing with the pandemic, again, the USS Theodore Roosevelt, does this create a time when adversaries might see an opportunity to act militarily, thinking the United States is unable to respond? Again, not necessarily a high probability of happening, but obviously if you're in the E-ring of the Pentagon, these are the scenarios you have to begin worrying about. I know a lot of people are looking at what are the Chinese doing in the South China Sea? Is China trying to take advantage of that issue? Something else just to keep on the radar screen going forward.
All right, and that's our look at the world next week. Here are some other stories to keep an eye on. The anniversary of NATO's founding is marked, and the G20 education ministers are scheduled to meet in Riyadh.
Please subscribe to The World Next Week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts, and leave us a review while you're at it. They help us get noticed and improve the show. Please note that opinions expressed in The World Next Week are solely those of the hosts or our guests, not of CFR, which takes no institutional positions on matters of policy. Today's program was produced by Zoe Collis with senior producer Jeremy Sherlock. Special thanks go out to Anu Kumar, Claire McGraw, and Anna Shortridge for their assistance. This week, our recording engineer, as has been the case, each week we've been doing remote recording with Zoe Collis. Zoe, again, thank you for pulling double duty. Our theme music is provided by Miguel Herrera and licensed under Creative Commons. This is Jim Lindsay saying goodbye.
And this is Bob McMahon saying so long and be safe, everyone.